Welcome everybody to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism live, and we may stream this, I don't know, on the Red Nation or on Nick's Substack. So wherever you're watching, welcome. I'm going to say the first few words because Nick is a little out of breath after running in from a nearby action, and so grateful that you were able to make the time to catch up with us and talk a little bit about everything that's going on in Minneapolis, in the Twin Cities area with, ICE. Obviously, this has been in the news a lot, and you had a really good discussion. I want to make sure people catch if they didn't catch it just the other day with a member of the Indigenous Protectors movement out there, talking about kind of the grassroots organizing that's going on. And I think it's a really, it's definitely an angle that you're not going to see in mainstream coverage or anything else. And so definitely encourage people to check that out. But I wanted to check in with you and just see, to kind of start, um, you know, your reflections on this. I know that it's been something even before, you know, the, the murder of Renee Good, which became like this national kind of flashpoint thing. You and I had been talking, a little bit, and you were like talking about students and families and people like that were dealing with ICE and, you know, uh, beefed up DHS presence in Minnesota. And so maybe you could just start with a little bit of context of, how you're reading things in this moment up there.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I You may not have caught up with me in a while, but I always like tune in. I'm sometimes an anonymous YouTube user because I'm on my work computer. Listen in when I'm doing lesson plans. I just caught the latest episode of the WrestleMania Imperial '80s podcast. So I really appreciate that stuff. It keeps, it really keeps me going in different ways. But yeah, here on the ground, it's really it's what I always tell people this. It's worse than what's being portrayed in the media, um, meaning that you're seeing a lot of these sort of actions where people are encountering ICE and getting brutalized, by police. But there's a lot of instances where that's not being filmed, um, and yeah, it's hard to say. You hear about it afterwards. Like I think probably the most heartbreaking image to come out was of a 5-year-old kid who was picked up and then sent to a Texas detention facility just like after school, essentially. Um, and he was still in his backpack and everything. And I want to just make it clear to people that they've been terrorizing childcare centers before Operation Metro Surge really went underway. There are what right wing influencers who were going to specifically Somali run daycare centers and trying to film families and children and just generally harassing them and creating a climate where people felt emboldened to actually physically break into these places and attack people. And so it's hard to describe the kind of level of assault that's happening. It's happening at both the kind of social level with vigilante violence as well as kind of a state level with um, the feds coming in. There's a lot of rhetoric being put out there by local elected leadership. There are some that are true to their word, people like Robin Wansley, but then there are others who the rhetoric is largely empty because they haven't really done anything other than file lawsuits. And there are things that they can do, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But you see Governor Walz, who was one of the architects of the police repression at Line 3 in 2020, 2021, and 2022. Um, he's now kind of positioned as this, figure who's kind of leading this battle against Trump. But he himself, recently decided to drop out of the current gubernatorial race because his popularity is falling because he's also succumbing to the attacks from the Trump administration. And then you see people like Mayor Fry, who was adamant not only during the George Floyd uprising, but currently about expanding police infrastructure and and also using police to repress, social movements. He's also, used the F word to tell ICE to get out of town, but has done little in terms of um, the doing anything in terms of getting people ICE out of the city and keeping people safe. And we've seen MPD, Minneapolis Police Department, really stand back. In fact, local law enforcement like Hennepin County sheriffs are like deploying, and there was a video from Status Coup, if people have been watching, when that right-wing influencer Jake Lang, who I didn't even know until he came, he was like, I think Minneapolis made him famous. He came here to for a pogrom against Somali people, and he ended up just getting piss dumped on him. And Trump, to my knowledge, hasn't really listened to his calls to deploy the military. But there was an infiltrator, what looked like an infiltrator, who was amongst the crowd in terms of like agitating and stuff, and he was kind of called out by the crowd. And you saw this like unmarked white vehicle pull up, and all these Hennepin County Sheriff's Department guys jump out and basically rescue what looked to be like one of their agents or their deputies. But it's important to remember that Hennepin County Sheriff's Department was also deployed at Standing Rock, and has this kind of really notorious history. So, Minneapolis Police Department, Minneapolis can say whatever they want, but at the end of the day, the Fraternal Order of Police in Minnesota has signed a letter clearly stating that they support ICE actions in the city. So this idea, like they're sending up this kind of illusion that like somehow the police are under the control of the city, which is just not true, because they've allowed them to attack children. They've allowed them to attack schools. Customs, there's a video that came out early on of Custom and Border Patrol tackling children in the snow, and shooting them like point blank range with chemical weapons. This is a high school, they don't care. This isn't just, they are for sure creating a climate of fear and repression for immigrant communities, but it's also not about that. If you watch some of the live videos with Greg Bovino, when he rolls around with his Customs and Border Patrol units, and he's also like sometimes flanked by Hennepin County sheriff's officers, sheriff's deputies, he's doing this for PR. He wants to get his licks in. He wants to get photos taken of them, basically, beating on everyday citizens. And if you watch those videos, they're deploying tear gas and chemical weapons like right next to elementary schools and in residential areas. It's creating a general kind of climate of fear and terror on the community. It's you can watch the reports that are happening. People, it doesn't matter like if you have a tribal ID, a passport, you're a US citizen, permanent resident, they're pulling everyone over and they're arresting them. There's even reports that have been documented in the media about them pulling people from hospital beds and dropping them off, outside of the Whipple facility, which is the ICE facility, because they don't have any grounds to keep them there. So there's a lot going on. It's hard to really describe the full kind of scale of this attack and how it's affecting people's everyday lives.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. I mean, I remember the only thing in my mind that I connected to as you're describing it, just within my own experiences, working at a school in West Philly during 2020 when the National Guard was deployed. And like as you're talking about like the tear gas and everything else, like we had kids that would just be like, oh, I didn't sleep last night because there's like tear gas coming into our windows and stuff like that. But like you're really talking, and you get into it in that conversation with what's his, I'm blanking on the name of it.
Vinny Dion. Yeah, Vinny
Vinny.
Dion. He's
Yep.
with Indigenous Protectors Movement.
Yeah, and yeah, he just talks about all of what you're talking about in terms of the scale of the targeting of the community, and also like just kids not even being able to go to schools and stuff like that. Schools being shut down, right, in some instances. So yeah, I mean, and I guess maybe that's a good way to move to the next discussion on this, which is sort of talking about the ways that the community is responding and the kind of organizing that's going on, which obviously we're talking with Vinny about. And you reflected in that conversation a lot too of ways that this also forges something within the community in terms of um, radical in the form, I guess, of how people come together, even if you know, it may not always articulate itself in terms of like radical politics, in terms of like what are the demands, or what are we looking to for a solution for this sometimes. But I appreciated that discussion, and maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the stuff that has been going on within the community, how people are coming together.
I was thinking about this in terms of what happened in Standing Rock. The people got together and kind of formed these, what people call mutual aid. I mean, this is just what colonized communities have been doing since time immemorial, even before colonization. They set up like institutions of care, and that's what I think a lot of these community watches are. They're keeping an eye out for their neighbors. There's also sites where you can get supplies. People haven't left their homes in several weeks, and they're doing deliveries, home deliveries for food. It's hard to describe to people like what's happening. I mean, last night, we ordered some food. It was just a busy night, and we didn't have any food at the house because everything has just been full steam. And we ordered some food and went to go pick it up at the restaurant. All the restaurants were closed because people weren't showing up, and it was just kind of a surreal experience. People look at you differently. There's kind of heightened racial tensions in the city as well. But I think by and large, the community has really come together to really protect its own, and to I've never felt sort of like more that I belong here than at any point I've ever lived. And I think this is largely from the experience of George Floyd, and like what Vinny was talking about. People are prepared for this stuff, and this is an attack. It's hard to describe. You can stay home, you can do whatever. It's going to find you. Every aspect of my life, I'm talking about this. And it has a very kind of toxic and negative aspect, but it's actually brought about conversations in my own workplace about larger issues, larger sort of struggles that are going on. Questions about unionization, all that stuff. It's coming to the fore, and I really hope. I can't stress this enough. I really hope, like in this moment of terrible danger, people are exercising what is the natural response, which is to defend yourself, to enact forms of human solidarity, not to be greedy. I mean, I think we think about like Mad Max or something like that when anarchy descends, and I saw there's like a Guardian piece that says like we're at the beginnings of a civil war. I don't know about that, but because if we're at the beginnings of civil war, then it's like, what has it meant for indigenous people to kind of live under these conditions for centuries? But we are, I think what's happening in this moment is disproving what can arguably said is sort of the ruling class ideology, that we are motivated by profit and greed, that human beings have been reduced to just how we interact with each other through social media and commodification of all aspects of our lives. And this is showing this is something clearly different. That in fact, the natural human response is not one of divisiveness, not one of coercion, not one of violence and oppression, but one of care and comfort. And I think there's something to look at this really terrible moment from that perspective. I think I'm really trying to find, as somebody who thinks about these things and has lived through them in various moments of my life, I always try to, that thing always amazes me the most, is that like, Fidel Castro called this the battle of ideas, and it's also the battle of emotions, like what you feel is correct, and you should act upon that. If you feel your life is threatened in this way and you're experiencing these things, the natural response is not to lie limp, it's to fight back. And that's what we're seeing. It's not an individual thing. This is a collective fight back. I don't know the outcome of any of this. But yeah, I don't have anywhere to go. I'm from here, man. Like I talk to my dad almost daily. He kind of checks in with me, like just to see how we are safe. And I'm just like, he's like, do you want to come home to the reservation? And I was like, I need to fight. Like, I need to be here because everyone else is here, and it's hard to describe. I don't really know, man. Like, it's kind of like, it's hard to describe when you're living through it. And I try to like look at it from a different perspective. I also try to see it from other people's perspective. And this is this is a very pivotal moment in time. But I think my hope is that these kind of infrastructures that are being created of like organizing are going to sustain us to something different, and a different outcome that's not just channeled through, you know, bipartisan politics, because that's what got us here in the first place. And I think people are very much realizing that. You have these conversations on the street that I just never thought I would be having with my, my own neighbors or coworkers. So yeah, I don't know if that helps describe the
Yeah,
situation.
no, it's good. And yeah, I mean, just solidarity obviously to all of you in it. And I think, like you said, I mean, Minneapolis has this very specific recent history. And that's one of the things you talk about in that conversation too, is like that, a lot of the collectives, organizations, connections that were built or that exist now were built during the George Floyd uprising, but now are entering into another kind of phase of struggle. And um, so there's always, I think, that process and that possibility, right, for how the replication of these moments and the connections that are built in them can, transform into something else, through that struggle. And so, yeah, I mean, hopefully, I agree with you in terms of the party politics thing, and I think that's one of the really challenging things right now because there's such a Democratic Party is trying so hard to make this an issue that they can say, "Hey, we're the ones on the right side of this," and I mean, we lived through that in 2020 and lived through it in 2016, right? And on and on. And so, yeah, I hope that people can, and I honestly don't know what that looks like, entirely in terms of moving beyond it either, because it's like, we have to actually build something beyond it as well, a vehicle that could get us beyond it as well, right? And I think that's something that we're kind of still trying to figure out in a lot of ways. But I think understanding and having that understanding that the Democrats may be saying some of what seem like the right things right now, but you know when they're in power, that all goes away, and they don't even wouldn't even talk about it, and maybe they wouldn't deploy them in the exact same way, but they still would be targeting a lot of the communities, right, that are still targeted by this administration as well. And so, yeah. um I don't know if you have anything else to say on that, but the other thing I wanted to do is kind of a pivot to talking about imperialism and Iran,
Mhm.
which is connected, but I don't know if there's anything else you want to say on that before we jump.
Not really. I mean, it's an easy pivot because, like, I think Alex Avinia wrote this in a foreign exchange pieces on Substack about how, the um, killing of Renee Good, the ICE agent who killed her, shot her in the face, was actually filming himself while he was doing it. It's very, very similar to the snuff films that were created by the Trump administration when they were blowing up boats in the Caribbean and killing people there under no sort of like, we weren't presented with any evidence that they were these like narco terrorists, right? But Renee Good was called a domestic terrorist and thus deserving to be executed. And I think we kind of see like it's not really an imperial boomerang because imperialism hasn't really left these lands, and it's the same with Iran. Like even the indictments against Maduro, if people were reading them, they say several things that are kind of funny. One of them was that the U.S. Justice Department was saying they kidnapped him and deposed him as president, after killing lots of people, because of indigenous people in the southern part of the state of Bolivar were experiencing illegal mining. So they're even gesturing, they're kind of creating this kind of humanitarian intervention thing that's saying like the Maduro government was oppressing indigenous people. And it's just silly, and then they were also making these connections that, Maduro had connections to Hezbollah, and that was kind of like, the back channel terrorist connection to Iran. And of course Iran had created trade agreements with Venezuela and was supporting them too. So yeah, I mean it is connected in that sense. Like we're just seeing, fascism is just the expression of imperialism at home, I guess is what you could call it. I mean, I fascism, I mean, I don't know, I have a whole thing about this. You call it fascism, yeah, sure it is, but it's also just colonialism. Like they haven't left yet. Like the fort they're using to run these ICE operations is literally on a military campus, and it's literally part of the same fort that was used to imprison, my relatives, called Fort Snelling. So nothing has really changed. It's just like Groundhog's Day. You're just waking up every single day, and it's the same day, but you're the only one that knows that the time has passed, kind of thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a great I love that analogy. I so I do want to say, I mean, so there's a piece, and it was one that I was thinking about, you know, I hadn't gotten around, you'd sent it to me. I hadn't gotten around to reading it yet, but I was like, oh, I need to revisit this. And then obviously, it takes on renewed importance as, we see I don't know what to call it, the impending war with Iran. I mean, it feels in some ways this stuff feels almost unavoidable at this point, which is obviously a problem that we have to, you know, move beyond because we need it to be. Um, but there's all the saber rattling around Iran right now, and similar. I mean, you talked about the indigenous, this idea of using like right to protect or whatever around. I mean, the Maduro thing is ridiculous because it's like they can't even stick to one pretext. They have to they have to make up a new one every day. Um,
The
but
irony of it all too is that, like, they're in their national assembly, they have more indigenous representation, like, than there are, like, percentage, per capita indigenous people in Venezuela. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I remember when I was there, they had like 24 indigenous representatives in their national assembly. They have 4 constitutionally mandated, but then they had these other like 20 or so that were elected at large, showing that indigenous people are very much part of the Bolivarian revolution and the state itself. So it was just kind of ridiculous that they were speaking on behalf. I mean, but you see this kind of humanitarian intervention stuff happening in Iran. Some of it's gone to absurd levels.
yeah, oh, it's absolutely unhinged. And unfortunately, a lot of the outlets that people often look to as like sort of left or whatever, like are repeating a lot of these claims or bringing on guests that kind of include them in what their analysis and so on too. But with Iran, like specifically, you were talking about the 12-day war in this
Mhm.
piece, which is out on Middle East Critique. I have a link to it in the show description. It's called U.S. Imperialism as an Indian War. Um, and, you talk about a couple of things. One is this linguistic, kind of symbolic resonance between U.S. militarism you know, and the wars against indigenous people, right? The like, and I think people are more familiar with this, like, you know, Apache helicopters, Tomahawk missiles, like that often they say in country or Indian country, referring to like a site of war that the U.S. is engaged in or whatever. But one of the things you bring out in the piece is that it's not just merely symbolic or like cultural or these linguistic things, but that actually also there's a legal um, architecture, right, or a set of legal precedents that these operations actually justify themselves based on. And so you can delve into it however you want to, but I thought it was a really important addition to some of that commentary, to not merely think about these things as symbolic or like out of the settler history of the United States, but also think about it as a kind of legal architecture as well.
Yeah, as somebody who teaches in American Indian Studies, I teach a lot on like federal Indian policy and law. And people often kind of think of this as kind of like, civil rights policy and law. It's its own separate field, and it only has to do with marginalized groups or whatever, but it's actually fundamental to the legal architecture, even the drafting of the Constitution. Oftentimes, if we know anything about the drafting of the Constitution, we hear about the debates that happened over slavery, right? Whether there would be slave states and free states, but also how those new additions to the union would be added. And that question, to be added, right, to the union, was a policy of annexation, right? And that was Indian policy at that time. So even the question of slavery was also a question of Western expansion and Western, the conquering of the Western frontier. And with the drafting of the U.S. Constitution, that kind of, that's a whole nother debate. When I teach in my courses, we talk all about that, like the debates that the so-called founding fathers were having at the time, because they recognized the military power of indigenous nations. They also recognized the diplomatic power of indigenous nations. And when there's a clause in the U.S. Constitution, it's not even an amendment, it was in the original Constitution, they call it the supremacy clause, meaning that treaties are the supreme law of the land, that only the federal government has the right to negotiate and enforce treaties. So when they negotiated treaties with indigenous nations, they negotiated under that clause, meaning that these are not just like kind of like cool little agreements about trading trinkets and beads or whatever for land, but this would be something that was codified within federal law that had to be obeyed, right? And oftentimes when we talk about that early kind of period of the drafting of the Constitution, we think of folks like George Washington, and he was the first president. So after the first Constitution was drafted in 1787, the United States then engaged in its first major war. And it was its first undeclared war, which was against the Northwest Indian Confederacy. And this was like Shawnee, Lenape, some Ojibwe people, and others, Miami, folks who created this Northwest Indian Confederacy in the Ohio River Valley because, as folks like Gerald Horne would argue, and I would argue, U.S. independence was more of a counter-revolution because the 1763 Royal Proclamation prohibited Euro-American settlement in the Ohio River Valley. And some would argue that the so-called Revolutionary War was fought to remove Britain's authority to prevent and curb and prohibit further expansion westward. So indigenous nations were well aware of this, during the Revolution. And so after the Revolution, the drafting, or the counter-revolution, after the drafting of the U.S. Constitution and the election of the first president, George Washington, they were presented with this problem because they had this like well-organized Indian Confederacy in the Northwest. You have the drafting of the Northwest Ordinance, which is like the first kind of policy for annexation. So the executive branch kind of raises the army, goes to Congress, and we need more money, because of this Indian threat. We're in debt. We need this land because we have no way to pay our military. They're paying everything in land. That was the only currency they really had. So they needed that land. They needed to secure that land. So Congress didn't declare war. They just, gave the authority essentially, or, ceded the authority to George Washington to wage this war. And it resulted in one of the worst defeats of the U.S. military in its history. It's called St. Clair's defeat. It was worse than the Battle of the Little Bighorn. This army basically wiped out almost to a man the entire Continental Army. So it was a very substantial war. It was probably the first substantial war that the United States had participated in. But it also set a precedent. It set two precedents. One, sort of granting or articulating the first kind of precedent for war powers that the executive held, and another to cast certain groups of people or nations who could be entreated with and those normative rubrics of law, but were cast out of the realm of civilization. So they don't, since they're uncivilized, they're merciless Indian savages, as it says in the U.S. Constitution, you can basically make endless war on them. This has been something that has been expanded to, ceaseless or endless war making from that point onwards, going into the 20th century, more than 150 engagements. I don't even know, it in these Office of Legal Counsel briefs that justify presidential or executive action in making war don't even know the exact numbers of how many wars have been engaged without congressional approval. So from 1790 to 1891, you had 14 sort of military campaigns. This is considered the longest wars in U.S. history, which are called the Indian Wars. There's 14 battle streamers on the U.S. Army flag that commemorate those. The first one being this one against the Northwest Indian Confederacy, and the final one being what they call the Pine Ridge Campaign in 1891, which culminated in the massacre of at Wounded Knee in 1890. So this, when Trump assassinated Qasem Soleimani, when he bombed Syria during his first presidency, the Office of Legal Counsel, which kind of functions as the Supreme Court of the executive, their lawyers who provide legal justification for the president's actions, they basically use this precedent as a way to justify the United States or the executive branch taking unilateral action, not seeking congressional approval, not going to Congress to get a declaration of war to do this. And so when we look at what happened during the 12-day war, I don't know if this is a fact, in the sense that I don't know, since the United States wasn't formally at war with Iran, but I do know that they will use the precedent of assassinating Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, as a way to say, well, we don't need to declare war to do military strikes on Iran. So when they bombed those supposed nuclear facilities, they were doing so under the auspices that Iran is outside of the realm of a civilized nation, meaning that we don't need a formal declaration of war. But also it is, it may have sort of normative kind of like legal rules, but because of its category as an uncivilized nation that has been criminalized and demonized as a kind of state sponsor of terror, we can do whatever we want to them. And so that's really where that kind of justification came from, I think. And I would also make the argument that because of these expensive definitions and ambiguous and loose and fungible definitions of what counts as terrorism, we've seen this also expanded to narco-terrorism in the Caribbean, thus justifying unilateral executive action against so-called narco-terrorists as identified by the United States, such as Nicolas Maduro.
Yeah, or even fishermen on boats too, right? But yeah, definitely. So let's see. First of all, thank you for all of that. That was great. So, mm, gosh, there's so much I want to talk about with you, Nick, but I know that we are somewhat limited on time, and so somebody asked, is that even a legal standard or definition? I'm not sure if is that the civilization question, maybe. I mean, I think that's it's very interesting, these connections between, like as you said, you talk about the lineage of terrorists, and even you and I talked a little bit about Tariq Khan's work last year
Mhm.
too on what is it? The Republic shall be kept clean, right? And the uh, you talk about it in a little bit in the piece as well. Just the Indian Wars, and this, and even that if you go back far enough, right, that red as a term, sometimes it's not clear, or there's these connections, right, between indigenous people, right? It is a reference point, but also communists, but also they thought indigenous people were communist or lived in a communist kind of way. Um, and all of this, but all of this becomes like the civilizational framework that they use, really, like, it comes down to property relations and like fitting in within this kind of Westphalian European centered paradigm. And any country that's like, or any people really that are sovereignty seeking in this day and age, That is what seems to be most targeted by US imperialism, whether that's, sovereignty within Iran or in Venezuela. Cuba is certainly seems to be more and more. I mean, obviously they've been undergoing the blockade for decades and decades, right? But um, the project seems to be to disrupt, any country, any space of sovereignty outside of, what the US says sovereignty has to look like, right? I don't know if I know that we have to wind down in a few minutes, Nick, but I don't know if you have anything else that you want to add on any of these topics, whether it's Venezuela, Maduro, Iran, or what's at stake right now.
I'll tell you this. I was actually really inspired by Sharice Burton-Stelly's work, Black Scare,
Mhm.
Red Scare, and as well as Tariq Khan's book, because both of them sort of trace these larger genealogies. And I think there's a tendency, and I really like, I've read what's his Aaron J. Leonard's book, his most recent one. I forgot the name of it. It's about the Red Scare against the Communist Party, right, and the repression of the Communist Party. And he kind of makes this argument that like there is a specific kind of repression that communists face, like the communist movement in the United States. But he doesn't really get into like the kind of racial components of that, or like even the colonial components of that. And I think he kind of attributes it to this kind of like this burgeoning kind of like Eastern European labor movement that's happening in the U.S. But what I appreciate about Tariq Khan and also Sharice Burton-Stelly's work is that they're tracing the kind of like origins within, these, like, whether it's Black people getting organized or joining the Communist Party, or even Indigenous people in Tariq Khan's work look like being kind of evoked or invoked as like the kind of original kind of savage communism, right? And it's obviously immediately so Red Scare or anti-communist sentiment gets tinged with this kind of racial element. And I think it's important because in the 19th century, there's typically this kind of glossing over of like indigenous movements and indigenous power at that time. But it's important to understand like how not only the military viewed indigenous nations, but also how policymakers viewed indigenous nations. The word communism first was like applied to indigenous people in the early 19th century. And they were seen, and it wasn't just Marx that was doing this, it was people who were trying to actually reform indigenous societies. Reform, by reforming I mean destroy, and basically proletarianize them, individualize them, turn them into workers, turn them toward God, or just completely eradicate them in general. And you even seen some of this, this form in like the kind of anti-blackness um, of the plantation slavery system, right? Believing that you had to tear these families apart and basically remake these people, right, into the servants of a white supremacist empire. So you see that, but it doesn't quite work, right? There are always these kind of traditions of resistance. They call it the Black radical tradition. One could argue there's an indigenous kind of tradition of resistance that you can trace back, that is always kind of being evoked. This idea of like a savagery, an uncontained savagery that needs to be contained, that's constantly operating outside of the bounds of civilized law. That's why you get the 23rd complaint of the Declaration of Independence, the final complaint, which is against the merciless Indian savages on the Western frontier. That's why you get this kind of fungibility of Indianness and savagery. And then it's kind of gets folded into the Red Scare moment, and then the anti-communist movement, the genocidal anti-communist movement that gets, perpetrated on a global scale, especially following World War II. And then you get, and the perfect examples of this are the Korean War after World War II, and then also the Vietnam War. Those were anti-communist movements. And the Vietnam War was never a declared war. It was never an official war of the United States. So you see these kind of movements happen, and you think about the way that, like, after the fall of the USSR, you kind of see the rise of this terrorist discourse. Is now not that becomes the permanent enemy of U.S. empire. So anyone who's labeled a terrorist, and now we're seeing, obviously that was used to justify the U.S. war on terror. And now we're seeing this play out again in this current moment with the national security memo, presidential memo. I think that Ken Klippenstein revealed or leaked, talking about the domestic terrorist threat. And there's even a newer version of National Security Council and National Security Intelligence. I can't remember what it is. A national security agency, intelligence agency, released a threat, there was a leaked document that now talks about economic and class-based grievances as part of this new domestic terrorist threat. So now we're seeing kind of a return, like in this moment, with the rise of socialist candidates, and people are like really disenchanted with socialism. Now we're seeing what they're calling class-based grievances as leading to quote unquote domestic terrorism or a new domestic terrorist threat. So this history can be traced, through settler colonial history, and it's worth saying that it doesn't take away from anything, and I think it actually expands our purview and grounds it in a historically situated kind of argument, that this nation was an imperialist nation from the get-go. And the way that imperialism operates isn't just completely externalized, but sometimes it's internalized to deal with whatever threat that it deems poses to its sort of hegemony or control or dominance.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great way to tie those threads together and kind of wrap this up. I do apologize to folks as a little bit of a shorter live, but Nick has a lot of things going on in his neck of the woods. Anytime I see a phrase like neck of the woods nowadays, I'm like, well, what does that come from? But
what does that mean? It's probably something bad. That's my
but we'll continue this. We'll have to do another conversation soon. Nick and I have actually been talking about some books we might do some discussions of together down the road when he has time to read again. And anyway, very much appreciate you again. Solidarity to you and everybody out in Minneapolis and other parts of the country that are, struggling against ICE or local police or whatever it may be, or a collection of all of the above. And solidarity, obviously, to folks who are, contesting U.S. imperialism and dealing with the ravages of it. So, anyways, peace, Nick. Thank you very much, and audience, we'll see you next week on Monday. We have Samantha Youssef coming through, who worked on the art department of Star Wars Rogue One to take down The Empire Strikes Back with us. So, looking forward to that on the Imperial 80s. All right. Peace, everybody.